Good evening, and welcome to an evening at Mary Lake. I want you to imagine that you're in this picture and that it's 1881. Can you imagine that? It's a hot summer day. The smoke is in the air, but of course there's always smoke with the pioneers are burning wood all the time. But today is different. Today, embers are starting to come down. You grab the kids, you go down to the lake, you sit in the water, and embers all fall all around you. Crown Island and Rocky Island go up like torches. And I wonder if the wind had been slightly different and Port Sydney had gone up in flames, would we be here tonight? Hi, I'm Ryan Kidd. My son is with me today to help with the presentation, and his name is Gordon. He's Director of Operations at Forum Research, Market Research Company in Toronto. My other son is Sean, and he's the Division Chief of Psychology at CAMH. As well as that, he's also an Associate Professor of Psychiatry at U of T. My wife is Eleanor. She's my best friend. She was a teacher, she's a poet, and she's the editor of my material. Professionally, I was taught grades 6 and 7 and 8 for 6 years, and then I switched to secondary school. Secondary school, I got into geography, and I became interested in geography and went back to university and did an honors degree in geography. I went up through the ranks of the geographic community and ended up in middle of 1980s as the president of OAGE. And OAGE stands for Ontario Association for Geographic and Environmental Education. At the same time, I decided to go into administration, so I went back to university and did an MEd. I finished my career in secondary administration in 1994. In 1994, my wife and I moved to Port Sydney. In Port Sydney, I got involved in various organizations, to begin with the Hill and Gully Riders. And then I went to the Chamber of Commerce and I became president of that, the Port Sydney Utterson Area Chamber of Commerce. And then in 2005, I switched to the Mary Lake Association. But before I did, the Chamber awarded me the life membership, and I was very grateful for that. The Mary Lake Association, I was on the board of that, and I'm still on the board of that. I became president of the Mary Lake Association in 2007. In 2007, I was also awarded the Citizen of the Year Award. I got also involved in various projects. In the year 2000, I worked towards producing a walk through time, showing the houses and the history of the town. It was modeled after production by Elizabeth Hogue in 1996. In the middle of the 2003-2004, my neighbor and I got together with a group of elderly people. They were all second and third generation people of Port Sydney. And we did a series of interviews. And from those interviews, we produced the first of our various books. The book was called These Memories I Leave to You, and it was produced in 2005 by Dave and myself. In 2011, they expanded that, and I produced a second book. It was called The Newcomers, And it followed up with the first book into the early part of the 19th century. And finally, in 2020, I also produced another book, which was a chronological history of Port Sydney. It's called The Intriguing Port Sydney. During this time, with the help of the town, I also produced the 2 plaques at the top of the stairs at the dam. And on the Mary Lake Association website, I also have a boat tour of Mary Lake, a historical boat tour of Mary Lake. So why am I here this evening? Well, it's obviously I'm going to talk about your home here in Mary Lake, and hope that it'll be an interesting, informative presentation. And it's also to give back what you've given to me. And we all know that Bill Clark had given an awful lot of pictures, but beyond that, various members of the community have given me snippets and bits and pieces of information over 25 years, and they add up to 54 gigabytes. Now, that's not just megabytes, that's gigabytes. And we'll take a look at this, the collection of them in the next slide. And in the next slide. Now, I intend to give this to the Heritage Center in Huntsville for safekeeping, but I want to show it to you first because you presented it to me. And I know that Zoom presentations tend to be kind of arid and so forth. So tomorrow night, on April 12th, we'll have a history session and also be able to ask your questions between 7 and 9 at Pine Lodge, which is known as now 3 Pine Lodge. And at that time, you'll be able to ask your questions and so forth. Also, at the very end of the program tonight, I'll give you information as how you can order my books if you want to take them. And tonight also, we'll have a 5-minute presentation or an intermission between the 2 parts of the presentation. Okay, how am I going to present this information tonight? The first part, we'll look at various people around the lake, and they will represent the stages of growth in our community. In their community, stage 1 was the lumbering and farm life and pioneer life was dominant, and that was between the 1870s and 1925. 1925 is the date that Sidney Smith died, and it pretty well ended the lumbering business in Port Sydney. To do this, we'll look at the Cottrells and also the Toms and the Ropers as example of farm life and pioneer life. The second part is the growth of the lodges. In the late 1800s, the middle class developed money and they had time and so forth. So the lodges began to spring up. First off, in the bigger lakes down to the south of us, and some very, very large lodges occurred at that time. In our case, it was a wee bit later in the 1890s, and of course, lodges are still here today. But in the stage 3 is development of cottages, and that started about 1900. And we'll come to that a little later in our program. And finally, the growth of camps. Well, the people came up and they decided that it was a good place to be. It was also a good place to be for their kids. So various lodges developed. We'll take a look at Grunwald in that stage. The growth of the camps, 1930 on, is that we'll look at Glen Okawa, will be the camp we'll look at. These and other examples will be seen in the first part of our presentation this evening. After that, there'll be a 5-minute break, and the second part of our presentation will be on Port Sydney and be based on themes. Rather than geographic, it'll be more on themes. And the themes we'll look at are the cottages, mills, bridges, stores, lodges, churches, and really importantly, the socialization of the people. You're probably lost already, so I'll show you where these places are. Echo Bay is where Glenokawa is. Tom's Bay makes sense. Grunwald was in Mud Bay. In Shelter Bay was where the Ropers were, and Cottrells were at the very top of the lake. After the break, we'll take a look at the MBC and Muskoka Lodge and Cliff House and so forth. When we're taking a look at Cottrells, Cottrells was a lumbering operation, but they were representative of 6 other lumbering operations that existed around the lake. One was at MBC, and that was where Bert Olin was, and he had a lumbering operation there. Bert Olin had learned how to run his mills from Enty, a chap who lived over at Lynx Lake Road, and he was the first black man in Muskoka. His father had come from Haiti and to Virginia, and then Enty had come up to the Mary Lake area, and Bert Olin had learned how to operate a mill, and he set up his mill at the land site of MBC. The second mill that we'll take a look at was Parker's Mill, and Parker's Mill was down here at Camp Minniowe. Parker's Mill started in the 1890s, but it was the Parker family lived just south of town on the road down to Bracebridge, and it was called Parkerville. The next mill that occurred was at Lightning Creek, which is a really interesting one because it was called the Dollards, and after being in Port Sydney and operating a mill here, they joined the shipbuilding business, and they operated a line in the Pacific Ocean called the Dollard Line, and it was famous at its time. Then, of course, there's our own mill here in Port Sydney, and we'll come to that later. And in the village, the other mill that was occurring was the shingle mill. It's at the east end of the bridge. And finally, up just north of the Bellevue Avenue is Lewis Clark had a mill as well. So those were our various mills. We'll now go on back to the Cottrells, and it's sort of representative of the various mills around the lake. The Cottrells operated a mill at the locks in Huntsville, and the remnants of the mill are still there. You can see the bridge that linked the mill to the mainland to get their products across. It's still there. The Cottrells caused a lot of consternation when they first built there because they had to put a dam in order to get power to run the mill, and the dam raised the level of the upper lake 6 feet. And there were a lot of unhappy people when their land got flooded out along the lakes. The other thing it did, however, what was a good thing, was it raised the level under the present bridge in Huntsville. And there was originally a rapids there, and it raised it 6 feet so that ships could get back and forth. And so it was a good thing at that stage. Okay, now we'll go on to the next slide. The Toms. The Toms originally came from England. He had quite a career on it. He had been to King's College, and his dad was an antiquarian. He also was the secretary to the Senate in Britain, and so he was a fairly well-to-do man. He had also looked after a magazine called Notes and Queries. There was a lot of concern in the late 1800s about losing the information from the past. And so the Notes and Queries was a way by which they were able to keep track of things in the past. And I think the present thing called Quorum, there's a website called Quorum, and it occasionally has items of the same sort on it. Going on, the Tom's house is still to be seen at the head of Tom's Bay, and the Toms married into other families, including the Somersets. Somersets were related to the Dukes of Somerset, and sorry, the other thing I wanted to mention was about the wife of Mr. Toms. Her name was Emily Brooker, and she was an actress. And in those days, actresses were not given the accolades that they are today. And so she was a kind of an outcast. And so the Toms came over, and they were known as, it was in a process called primogeniture. And that meant that the elder son got all of the wealth of the family when the father died. And so Mr. Toms and our Toms was not the second, it was not the elder son, so he didn't get anything other than a well-wishing. He also was a remittance man, and that was a term that was used in those days. Remittance meaning that he occasionally got checks from the family to help out. Okay. The Lawrences came from the Scilly Islands off the coast of Cornwall, and they had moved to England, and then they moved out to the New World and set up operation at the top of our lake. You can see the amazing amount of work that had to go into clearing the land, and that has all been lost again because the trees have grown in again. Charles Lawrence married one of the Crompton ladies, and her father was a minister, and he was responsible for 20 Anglican churches around the area. In those days, every so often, a lot was set aside for the Anglican churches, and it was I don't know why it was Anglican, other than that was the dominant religion of the time, and he was responsible for 20 churches that grew up around there. The Lawrences also had a large family, and one of the things that was noted in those days was the fact that a young man could only travel, would always have to marry within 2 miles, because that was the distance he could comfortably walk after work and then get back in time for the work for the next day. So it was important that when they had a big family like the Lawrences did, to have social affairs. And there's a story about one dance that was held there, and it was over at 3 o'clock in the morning, and it was a long, long walk for the people from Port Sydney to walk down on the ice to Port Sydney. Here's a picture of the Lawrence house and barn. It was after the Lawrences had been there, Jan Ostrovsky took over the Lawrence house and it set it up as Griffin Lodge. Ropers. Well, the Ropers, I guess you can see a bit of a pattern now. The Ropers were, again, a well-to-do family, and Coleridge Roper went again to King's College, and he, in his younger days, went to South Africa, and he became a friend of Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes is the man who had the diamond mines and after whom Rhodesia was named. So when Coleridge came back, he went to Nebraska first and then came and settled on Mary Lake. The picture here shows Bill Clark and two of the granddaughters of the Roper family. We had a pleasant afternoon with them at Bill's porch, and they told us lots of stories about the Roper family. The Coleridge was a bit of a bon vivant. He also ran a cricket club in the summertime and another club in the wintertime. And they played with teams from Bracebridge and from other towns in the neighborhood. He must have had a worry, a bit of a worry, because one of the things that was really prominent in those days was tuberculosis. And his brother certainly did. His brother, incidentally, was involved with a battle in the Caribbean, one of the Caribbean wars. He was at Texas. He had a ranch in Texas, and he went to Bittern Lakes in Alberta, again, presumably to escape from tuberculosis. And Cecil joined him. Also, the Liddells went from Port Sydney to Bittern Lake, and so we have a connection with that. Grunwald, William Gall was the man who set up Grunwald, and his dad was a judge in England, and he came over with the intent of setting up a lodge, and it was in 1901 is when he did this. But anyway, is that he went into training, went stay and worked at a lodge in southern Ontario to learn the ropes. And so when it came time to build Grunwald, he was well prepared. Grunwald was built in 9 months and became operational in 1901. There's a picture of Grunwald. It was a very impressive edifice. It would hold 123 people. The porch was famous for it, and it ran only in the summertime. And of course, it was only taxed in the summertime, because in those days, taxes were based on when you operated, not as they are today. He ran the lodge for quite a while, but in 1908, it went under, at least with his operation, and it was then bought by the Whites. Whites had a hardware in Huntsville, and they operated it through until 1918 when it was burnt. Now that's a funny story, because it was burnt on the evening of the end of the World War I. And the thought is because it was called Grunwald, which means green forest, somebody decided that it was operated by Germans, and so therefore it was fair game to be burnt. So it went, and the only thing that's left of Grunwald today is a concrete cistern that is in the bush just up the road from it. It was quite a very forward-thinking operation. At that time, there was a real effort to develop various heating methods, and one of them that they used in this one was glaciacetylene. And finally, we come to Glen Okawa. Glen Okawa is down near the town, and it was curious because it had no roads to it. It was run by a character called Glen Allen, and he was always acting. He was a pianist, he was an actor, he was a dancer, he was a conversationalist, he was a character. He was born in 1904, and in the middle 1920s, he joined with a group called the Dumbbells. The Dumbbells originated in the First World War and probably were a bunch of soldiers who decided it was better to do acting and to entertain the troops than it was to stay in the trenches. The dumbbell term came from the name of the motto of the 3rd Division, and it was supposed to mean strength. Well, these guys didn't mean strength. They took on everybody, from generals to sergeants. They made fun of everything. They ran skits. They had female impersonators. And when the war was over, they were so popular that they decided that they were going to take a tour of Canada. And that's where Glen Allen joined them. The tour across Canada included Dungannon, which is where my grandparents lived, and it was halfway between Wingham and Goderich. And my grandmother used to talk about Al Plunkett and what a character he was when she put him up to stay while the show was on. Life at the camp. This shows Glen Allen with the kids at the camp. He was a real character, and he had a way with shy kids. He would make them into heroes, and with the loud, brassy kids, he would manage to tone them down. And the kids did all the normal things they do at camps. They had trips and canoe trips and swimming and all that. And they also, in Glen's case, they had something called the Riot. The Riot was a play that was put on at the Port Sydney Hall every summertime. And it was full of the same sort of thing, I guess, that probably the Dumbbells were. And the kids told stories, and in fact, they told kind of risque stories, which must have kind of shocked some of the parents. But any event is that it was a really popular show, and it was enjoyed by all. The only thing left of Glen Okawa today is a couple of cabins that are up in the bush. But one other thing is that when I was doing the research on this, is that I ran across a couple of brothers, one of whom was a surgeon from Toronto General, and they had attended Glen Okawa, and they told me all sorts of stories about it. One other thing that happened there was a woman who got in touch with me, and her husband had, in his will, had specified that she should throw her wedding ring into the lake, and so we set it up, and because he had felt so enthralled with the camp that he felt that he should leave a memento. Okay, next. So where do we go from here? We're going to go down the east side of the lake, and we'll start off with MBC, and then we'll look at Captain Cock, where Dead Man's Island is, and Muskoka Lodge, and also we'll take a look at the southeast corner, and that will be about Cliff House. Okay, let's go back then to NBC. NBC started and this is representing, of course, the camps and so on, but then it started in 1931. But And before that, a group of young Baptists in Toronto had decided that things weren't very good in Toronto. And so they had their first attempt at operating a camp was over in Lake Erie. It wasn't very successful because the weather didn't cooperate. So in 1931, they opened up and came up to present site of NBC. And this is where Bert Olin had his lumber yard. All that was on the property were a couple of kind of broken down houses. And so the girls got the houses and the boys got to live in the camps and tents. They had a really rough time when they started, and because they started in 1931, which was the height of the Depression. And so at various times it almost went under, but they kept at it, and eventually it became successful, and it is very successful today. Bert Olin built the pulpit for the present Baptist Conference, or Muskoka Bible Conference as it's called. The pulpit was made up of all the different kinds of hardwoods that were to be found in Muskoka. And he took it to the World's Fair in Chicago, and it was presented and shown at that time. Now we come to Captain Cock. Captain Cock was a character, and it was 1869 when he arrived, and he was 62 when he settled on the island. An advanced age, because before that he had been a captain on the Great Lakes and had operated ships on the Great Lakes. And so he arrived on Captain Cock's Island, and he built his cottage on it. The cottage was interesting because it had windows like portholes. And he also built a causeway from the north end of the island. You can still see the rocks in it, across to where Minneowi is today. And so he was able to travel back and forth to the island. He became famous with Emma Liddell, who was married William Clark. They were the early people, and she operated the Liddell store because he managed to put one of her daughters in the family way. And so she had a real bone of contention with Captain Cock. Here he was 60 odd and marrying a teenager from her family. So when the family, Captain Cock, went to shop for goods, he didn't shop at Liddell's store. He rode down and they kept his kids at the town dock, and he walked all the way to Utterson rather than face Emma Liddell's wrath, because she was very ticked off about him. On May 8th, 1889, he wrote his will, and he died on May 24th, 1989. So it's only 2 weeks before. His will says, 10 years after my death, all real estate shall be sold, and then be equally divided among the surviving members, and also the island be reserved for a resting place for my old body or any of my children, and be known from this date as Captain Cock Island. Well, 2 conditions in his will were not observed, because they cut the trees down off the property with the Parker family, and I mentioned that earlier. And also, Camp Minneowi didn't call it Captain Cock's Island for obvious reasons, and so it became known as Dead Man's Island. Next. Picture of Captain Cock's Island. Muskoka Lodge. Muskoka Lodge was run by the Ginsburg family, and they'd come from Odessa in Russia in the early 1900s. And I should mention about Israel, not Morris is shown in this picture, but Israel was the mayor of Huntsville in the early 1930s and also in the late 1940s. And he must have been a really going concern, because in the 1930s he managed to get build the arena, as well as get the present day bridge built. And in the late 1940s is that he also built the hospital, and or at least it was in his term that a hospital was built, and the streets were paved, or the sidewalks were paved. So he was a really going concern. At the same time, his brother Morris, he was operating a camp, which started in Muskoka Lodge, started in 1935. Now this was no little wee camp; it was a big operation. They had a staff of 100 people, and there were 400 people who could be handled in the camp. And they were Jewish people, and of course, there was prejudice existing in those days as well. And so the Jewish people from Cleveland, Rochester, and Buffalo, as well as those from around Toronto, came up to this Muskoka Lodge, and they had there was a man by the name of Sam Handler, who he had entertainment that came from, it was the same entertainment that was on the Ed Sullivan Show. So it was a big operation, and the 100 staff, of course, denuded the whole area around with for people, and so it caused it was a very big operation. It was set up in a kind of a T-shape operation, with the main lodge and the library and the riding stables and so forth along the road, the Muskoka Road 10, and then from the T part of the stem of the T, it was down towards the lake, and they had a couple of other big cabins in there, as well as the boathouse, and the tennis courts were held down there. The effect on the neighborhood was again important, and one of the things that happened was a golf course was built, and it was, you can see where it is, located 3 miles, and it was a 9-hole golf course, and it was built strictly for the people of the Muskoka Lodge. The lodge closed in the 1960s, and it was a kids camp was held there temporarily, and then it was eventually closed down. The next one we'll take a look at is Cliff House. It was one of the very first families, and they came in 1869. And James Jenner and Fanny Jenner were the two, and they had built this house, the original farmhouse. They had 7 kids, one of whom was Robert. And Robert was the one who then built the rest of the lodge. And you can see the buildings that were built. There was the annex on the right and the main lodge on the left. And then there was a cottage built a little later on. And they had a large number of activities. And the costs in those days, just to give you an idea, was $15 to $29 a week, and that included the meals. A far cry from what it is today. Dave Scott, the chap who worked with me, he took over in 1950s and made it a housekeeping cabin. And he's particularly proud of his repeat business. There are all kinds of people came back to it. And it's the oldest lodge continuously owned by the same people in Muskoka. And you can see a picture of the main lodge in the annex, as well as the Joe. Joe was one of the steamships that plied the lakes, and it brought guests from Huntsville to the lodge. Now we'll take 5 minute intermission at this stage, but I wanted to just show you on the right at the bottom is Sydney Smith, and they're seen at the dam. It will take 5 minutes so you can recover, and I can take a break. Thank you. Hi again. At the beginning, I mentioned that we had help from in 2003. Dave Scott and I interviewed a group of people, elderly people in the second and third generation. And of course, Bill Clark provided a lot of pictures, but these other people provided a lot of information. They included Alma Smith. Alma Smith's husband was a stonemason and a builder. Mel and Jean Clark, they were builders as well in the community. Harvey Hughes worked on the school board for years and years. Laura Clark, she had a lodge we call Victoriaville, and she was also a writer in the Huntsville Forester. Clara Watson, of course, was at the general store. Kay Beamer helped with elderly people. Doug Hughes was a relative of Harvey, and Kay Beamer was, she was associated with Cliff House, and Kay Cosman was the one who helped with the elderly people. And so we interviewed them in a number of sessions. And like good school teacher, I had set up to interview them and had a series of headings. Well, these headings didn't materialize. They just wanted to talk about whatever they thought was important. And here's one of the sheets that's showing what they talked about, and you can see what a variety it was. It took me a whole winter to index this and to get the material sorted out. But in any event, it was worthwhile. It was really interesting because they knew the life in Port Sydney firsthand. Cottages, the first of our themes. The cottages we'll look at here are related to Cliff House because Cliff House also had, Robert Clark had set up a series of lots along the lake, about 100-foot lots. And he did this for his guests. The guests came up and they enjoyed the lake, and so they then wanted to get a piece of the lake. And so he sold these lots, and I'm only going to show a couple of the cottages that were built there. But the first one is the Bells Cottage. It's over under the cliffs. Bells were a couple of elderly women and their nephew, and they operated the boathouse, as you can see here. And they were very, very stiff upper lip English types. At the other end of the cottages was the McLaughlin Cottage. The McLaughlin Cottage, he was a dentist, and as the story goes, is apparently he had a weakness for liquor. And so apparently in the weekends is that he would imbibe and then repent on Sundays and throw the bottles into the lake. And then the next week is that he would want the bottles back, so he hired Lewis Clark to dive for them, and he could start all over again. This cottage was burnt, and the present one took over its place. I'm going to Berkswild. It was a cottage owned by Jane Garden, and Jane Garden has since died, but it represented the old cottages. There are only 2 or 3 of the old cottages that are left around, and these had a bit of character by themselves. They weren't the antiseptic kind of new cottages that we associate with. And I'm going to leave this on for a moment while you have a chance to read it, because it describes Berkswild, which was Jane Garden's relatives, her ancestors' cottage. Okay, you can see the type of cottage and the type of building they were. The next group of cottages we'll take a look at are the run by the Moody's, and they're to the west of Cliff House. and are the three big cottages that are along the lake there. The first of them was owned by the Stockfords, and the Stockfords had money in Standard Oil, and so they were very well-to-do people. And they built this cottage. One of their daughters married Charles Moody, C.W. Moody, and he was called C.W. And he was from Hamilton, and he operated knitting mills in Hamilton, as well as other industries. And C.W. and a group of other men got together, and they produced a hydroelectric power at the Dessous Falls down the way. The power that was generated was used by the General Electric plant that established itself in Hamilton, and probably had a good deal to do with the building of the steel mills, because ample hydropower was important. C.W. had sisters and brothers, and Jean Moody was a sister, and the other cottage to the east of the main one was built for her. Her other brother was John, is seen in the picture here, and John had a whole lot of, he was involved with a lot of companies and in Hamilton area. And the Moody's came to the lake because of the fishing, and they had these large boats. John was also noted because he managed to buy the first car in Canada, the very first car. And apparently, if he had bought it 20 minutes earlier, it would have been the first car in North America. It was a 1898 Winton, and he bought it for $1,000. One of the daughters married Hugh Hand, and Hand came from Cooksville, and it had the company called Hand's Fireworks, and he brought fireworks to the community and is noted because he provided the fireworks for the turkey dinner for years and years afterwards. Now we come to the lumbering part, the mills. I've shown a series of pictures here. The first one shows the Shire camp. It's in Brunel, and it shows the importance of cooks because they're sitting front and center there. What happened was that the lumbering was best off in the wintertime because the trees were easier to fell and they were easier to take out on the frozen ground. And so the men of the community would pack up and leave and go to the camps for the wintertime. And they were fairly ripe by the time they came out because they didn't have showers or anything like that. So they got sewn into their underwear, and it was there till the springtime. They cut trees down and they placed them on there, put them on the dumps along the side of the lake. And here's logs just east of Forest Island on the lake. The trees that were around, the government had a deal where they wanted pine trees, and this worked really well because they got settlers in, and the settlers took the trees down and so on. But in any event, what was wrong with this was the forests of this area were mature forests. Pine in the evolution of forests is partway down the list. So the main forests were of nut trees, walnut and oak trees and hemlock and also beech nut. And these trees and the logs from them didn't float very well. And so they had a heck of a job getting those logs down to the mill. What they would do is put a string around a string of logs around them around the heavier logs, and then tie them to it so that they would be floated. Otherwise they'd sink. And there's a a bunch of them in the bottom of the lake down near us at the cliff, which a windstorm had come up and broke apart the supporting ring of logs, pine logs, and they all sank there. This shows the gem. Actually, there were three gems. There was one 35-foot, one 40-foot, one 45-foot built in this period of the late 1800s, and they were the workhorse of the lake. And in this case, the gem is seen towing a log raft down the river. On the east side, on the right of the picture, you can see Stayers Point, and this is where apparently they dumped a lot of the sawdust, and it was also the place where the boats tied up in the wintertime and were stored in the wintertime. Further downriver from the dam was the lumberman's dam, and that was because there was a shallow spot in the river down below the present dam, and so they had to, when the logs went down in the springtime and they sent logs down to Bracebridge, is they had to get them past the shallow spots. So they built a lumberman's dam down there, and you can still see the stones from it. And here's the sawmill and the grist mill. They had the grist mill can be seen in the background, and it was used for grinding up oats and wheat and so forth to make flour. And in the foreground here is the sawmill itself, and you can see the slabs being cut off the logs, and the big pile of them there. There was also a kiln that was operated to dry the lumber. And you can see in the next picture the way by which they got the logs out. They used a little wee railroad, and it took the logs from the mill down to the corner at Muskoka Road 10. And it was still there in the 1950s. When kids were going to school, they would walk along the road. And you can see the logs piled up in the back and the near ground there. Here's another picture that shows it perhaps better. You can see the grist mill in the foreground here, and this sawmill. And incidentally, that's Sidney Smith's house there in the background, and it's the shed. And along the way here is the Algonquin, which was a steamship that was first built in the 1870s, and it operated on the lakes until the 1890s. And it was a side wheeler, and it was about 80 feet long and had a draft of about 5 feet, and it was about 12 feet wide. What you can also see here is the way in which they powered the mills. There's the outflow of where the water went, and the water went through an opening near where the ship is and flowed down through and out below here. And that's what drove the power of the mill. And the present dam is over here. And when, of course, they fixed up the whole area, they blocked off this previous mill. You can see the roadway that is stretched along here, and a group of people standing on it. The roadway went just along the side of the hill, and you can see the hill in the background here. The other mills that were around was the shingle mill, and it was at the east end of the bridge. And you can see here is this man in the third from the left here is Lewis Clark, and he was Bill Clark's dad. Lewis Clark also operated a mill off the end of Bellevue Avenue, and it was a little later, but you can see how the mill operated here. Now, the bridges were important because they determined where the stores were and where the roads were. And so this first bridge was built, and it was across the flats to the flats at the just below the present dam, and it went up the side of the hill. And the reason they built it there was because the river was very shallow, and there were stones and so forth. So they built it there, and that was a bit of a mistake because the bridge washed out eventually. So they built another bridge further down, and again it washed out. And then finally, they built the iron bridge, which is, you can see the abutments for it. And this iron bridge was operated for years before the present dam bridge was built. The iron bridge, of course, it redirected the roads, and the roads determined where the stores were. And here's a little map that shows all of this. Of course, here are the mills, and the Falls View Road, and it went down and across the river where the first first bridge was, and up Bridge Street to where to where those stores were. The other thing that you can see here is this is where the road needed a lot of sand, and so the sand that came from this spot, you can still see the pit. It's a great big pit. A new house has been built in there, and the kids that did this, dug the sand out, were called sandpipers. And because most of the men were gone in the wintertime, these pipers were young boys. And so 3 o'clock in the morning, these young boys would go and start the fires to thaw the ground to get the sand. And so they then would use the sand on the hillside here. And to get to the logs to the mill, they would go down here past the White House, down past Sidney Smith's house to the mill. This is where the road went when the first road went across and the first dam went across. And there was another dam here, and then finally the iron dam. And McDonald's Hill was up here, and Sally's Lane was here. So that was the arrangement, and we'll now take a look at the stores. This is Fawcett's store, and it's gone now because you can see it's so close to the road that in the 70s, it was torn down because it was an eyesore, and it was also a problem. But the Fawcett Mill store was Sidney Smith was the man who gave the land to Fawcett because he had helped with the town plan. The town road plan had been established, and the Fawcett helped with it. So Sidney Smith gave him the land for this store. It was originally a one-story building, and then these other stories were added to it. His daughter, David Jones, took over in 1888, and his daughter married John Stevenson, and they operated the store until 1986 when it was torn down. Next one. The Chester store operated from 1894, and the Chester store was originally down much closer to the road. And in 1934, when the Winfields took over, they decided to move it up the hill. And apparently it was something that the whole town showed up to watch the operation of moving it up the hill, because I guess it was really something. One of the interesting things was that Mrs. Chester was a piano teacher. And when you think of it, is that there would be, in the late 1800s, there was no no music or at all, nothing, unless you provided it. Nothing in the computers, no radios, no TV, nothing. And so Mrs. Chester was very popular. She taught music and provided it. The Chester store, incidentally, because it was right beside the faucet store, they mainly sold animal feed, and it was operated on that basis. Next. The butcher store is the next one of the three of them that were in this area. And the butcher store was started in what was it, they settled it in 1879, and Mary Butcher started a dairy in 1903, and it operated as a store from 1903 to 1920. And it ran out of steam at that time. It would the business died out because the town was moving to the west, and the mills were starting to close. She made a dairy, and she kept it for 20 years, and I'll refer to it later. The other stores around included the Hogabon store, and you can see where it's located here. It's where the Muskoka Road 10 comes down to the lake and then makes a sharp right turn. And it was located here. And it's located before the Liddell store, which was in this location. Hogabon was an interesting man. He was the reeve of the township for a while. And the fire took out the present store, and the fire burnt it in the late 1870s. The next one, and this is the Liddell store, which was built across the way. The Liddells owned land on the east side of the Muskoka Road 10, or the north side, and they bought the land for this store from Sidney Smith. And it operated from it's still there. They took down the porch area, and originally the store was across from a pond of water, which has been since filled in and made the parking lot. It was filled in the 1930s. You can see the ladies are all wearing long dresses in this case. So it operated till about 1920 as the Liddell store. And then in 1920 to 1927, Bill Clark's mother took it over, and she operated it as a boarding house, and it was called the Balsams. And then the Haas took over after that. And it's the Haas that after whom the road is named that runs up beside it. Other stores. There was the Crawford store, which operated across the road from the school, and the school was on the east side of the bridge where Goodwin, and it's the Goodwin. Sorry, the boarding house on the east side of the river, and it was the Crawfords operated a store across the road from that. The Goodwins operated a store on the east side of the river up on the road, and it lasted for a little while until the bridges closed. The present store is that it opened in 1913, and it was the Crawfords who operated it, and then the succession of owners owned it after that. Churches were really important in those days, because there was you figured there was no entertainment, and then the house would be quiet, and unless somebody came in and visited. So the churches they held 2 sermons each Sunday, and people frequently attended both of them because they had a chance to meet with other people. And the first marriage that occurred in this church was with William Clark and Emma Liddell. And William Clark is the the scion of the Clark family, and Emma, I've already referred to. She ran the store and was the one who was ticked off at Captain Cock. The churchyard in the Anglican Church is it shows a who's who of all the people who lived in Port Sydney at that time who were Anglican. They included the McClures, the Rumballs, the Crawfords, the Gardners, the Toms, the Newlove, the Neeshaws, the McGinnises, the Smith, the Johnsons, the Mackenzies, the Bridges, the Trollops, Stonehouse, the Bishops, and the Clarks. The Lynch Gate was named as it was built for Sidney Smith. When the church burnt down, the original church burnt down a few years ago, and in the process, the bell got wrecked. So my sister and I gave the church a bell that we had, and it came from my grandfather's blacksmith shop. Again, it was from Dungannon, which is halfway between Wingham and Goderich. And he had a bell at the top of his blacksmith shop, and he rang it at 7 in the morning, 6 in the morning to wake up, 7 in the morning, noon, 1 o'clock for lunch, and then 5 o'clock. And he rang it for 6 days a week. And their weeks were a little different from ours. In any event, is that in the mid-1930s, when my mom and dad got married, is the best man got over exuberant and he broke the rope to the bell. And so a few years later, when we recovered the bell, I got the piece of rope. And so when it was their 40th wedding anniversary, I attached the rope to this shape of the bell. And the anniversary says, the note at the bottom says 40th anniversary of breaking the rope and tying the knot. All our best hopes, your family. So we donated the bell to the church, and it could be heard now on Sundays. The United Church is very much the same as it was when it was first built. The things that are different are the picket fence. It was built to keep the cows out, and the driving shed, which is around behind. And the other thing that was different in the church is that it had a pot-bellied stove, and it had a vinyl kind of floor. So they replaced that with hardwood and so forth. But still, it's pretty much the same as it was in early days. Alan McGinnis and Julia Watson were the first ones who were married there. And the people who attended the church were the Kays, and actually the Kays in 1884, the church was held at their place until it was built later. The Hughes, the Stanworths, the Bennetts, the Gardners, the Phippins, and later the Watsons and the McClures and the Browns. This originally was a Presbyterian church. And in 1925, the Presbyterians and the Methodists joined together, and that it is now called the United Church. Now, because we've been talking about the town and around the lake, is that there's an impression probably left that was all that was happening. Well, here's a map that was built in 1889 showing the land distribution. And you can see that all the land was basically taken up by farms, or attempted to make it up by farms. The land wasn't very particularly good for farming, but they made an attempt to try and do it. So I wanted to show this. Now the lodges. This is the village inn, and it was one of the first of the lodges. And you can see on the village inn here, this oak tree, is now a giant oak. And there was a walkway along the front of it and so forth. And it was in there because it served the needs of the shingle mill, which was across the road. And it's been in operation ever since. It was lucky in location. The second group of lodges, I kind of arbitrarily named them as ones were lucky in location, and these ones were lucky because they were on the water. And one was the Bellevue Lodge, the far distance, and also Ferndale, which Bill Clark operated. Bill Clark uh, took over Ferndale, and he astounded them by raising the price of the lodgings to, I think it was $25 a week. So the Bellevue Lodge, it was operated by the Clark family. It was another brother or cousin of Bill's, and they like a lot of these lodges, they tried to incorporate various things that would make life easier, and so they had a water tower up the hill, and so forth. The next group, these ones I'm calling expansion of someone's house, and this one is McGinnis House, and it was operated just opposite Morgan Avenue down in the center of town, and Victoria Villa. It was operated by Laura Clark and her family. And when the lodges became very, very popular, these people decided to open up their houses and operate lodges. The next group of lodges I'm calling happenstance lodges. In 1930s, the Dion quintuplets occurred. Now, this was a really a special thing, and people traveled from miles and miles around to see these babies. And so Port Sydney was halfway between Toronto and North Bay, where the Dion quintuplets were, and so therefore it became a stopping place for people going north. And the Mulvaney had cabins, and they were across the road from Greer School, and the Marshalls had cabins just a little further up the road on the west side, and so people came and stayed in them, and then went on to North Bay, and so that's the curiosity or the Dion advertising. Next. And the final group of lodges is represented by the Riverview Lodge. It was located at the sharp turn on South Mary Lake Road, where the road turns away from the river into inland. And it was quite a nice lodge, and it only lasted 6 years because it was burnt down. It caught fire. And this was the fate of a lot of the lodges. Next. Now, on the household level, I'm referred to as Mary Butcher. She kept this diary for 20 years. And so the diary was far too large to write up. So what I did was I summarized it. And I summarized it under sort of 4 headings: the work and the health and the household, and then the visiting, which is on the next page. And it operated, this diary was really something. And it was kind of boring in places, but it told a lot of information about what life was like. And so under the work part, George was her husband, and he sold all kinds of goods. They in the store, these stores were not just for the usual things we see today. Is they had sleighs and wagons and sewing machines, and then of course the men would go to Utterson to unload the rail cars, because Utterson was a very thriving center at these days, except when the roads were impassable in the wintertime. The health was an important thing as well, and it was very, very dominant in the diary. Of course, there were colds and flu, the grip. That was, everybody had those things, but there were lingering ones like the typhoid and the chickenpox and diphtheria. And these were, in some cases, fatal, and particularly the mumps, which was in the news today, at this stage. Doctors were not around, but what they would do is they'd make household calls at night if necessary. And that was really something when you consider today we have to travel to town and see your doctor. And also mortality was there, and it was a fact of life. And without the socialization and care of the government, is that when somebody died, like a mother died, the community looked after the children, or more importantly, the father would hunt for a cousin or an aunt, and they would move in and then would look after the children. The household. The household, it was washing every week, of course, would be Monday. And the problems of getting clothes dry, like they didn't have dryers. So they'd have to watch the weather. And in the wintertime, of course, is the sheets would come in all frozen and they'd have to thaw them out. And of course, there was spring cleaning and the fall cleaning as well. It took days to clean up the house. And the larder is something that we think of today. We're not really into larders because we can go to the store daily. But in those days, is that you'd have to have a larder. And then, of course, there was a problem of keeping food cold. And they used ice from the ice machine, from the lake, and they had to fill up the ice house in the springtime with ice from the lake. And they also used the coolness of the basement. They'd have something called a dumb waiter, and it was a box which would be brought up into the room to get stuff out of, and then would sink down into the basement where it was cool, and they would keep food that way. And also that was in the root cellar. And also they would have in the root cellar, they'd have preserves and food. Also is that the killing of a pig in the wintertime and the hunting and getting a deer, that was really, really important because it meant the survival for the wintertime. And of course, in the meantime, there was always sewing. And sewing and making clothes was an ongoing job, and it was because they couldn't buy clothes. So the final thing is about the visiting. People, if you didn't have visitors, you had the house and the kids, and the women were the mainstay of the community in this way. Men got out and worked, but the mother would be left in the house, and the house was of course quiet. There was no other than the kids. There was no sound, and so when somebody came, it was really important. And so visitors, they'd come in for tea or for a meal, or oftentimes are just invited in to stay over. And that was very, very important. And of course, the church 2 times on Sunday. Another thing is the WA, the Women's Institute, and in the church was really important, and it gave women a chance to get out. Traveling salesmen would drop by, and they would drop off books and so forth, and that was again important. And finally, when the gem came, there was much more interaction around the lake and so forth. So the women in the household were really, really important. And also, I think it's important to think that about the size of the family. Large families were common, and that was because, well, of course, there's no TV, but in any event, there was the large family was really importantly. There was no welfare and no help from the government. So if you didn't have a large family to look after you in your old age, you were in for the poorhouse. And so that's why they had large families. I mention this because Emma Liddell, and she was the one who again gave heck to Captain Cock. She was also married to William Clark. And she had 12 children between 1870 and 1899, and died in 1899 at the age of 45. She was just worn out, but she represented the women. And she's also found on the front of my second book called The Newcomers. On the community level, Sidney Smith, he saw himself as an English squire with the village. He was, it's centered around his mills. And when the mills finally ran out of lumber and so forth in the mid 1920 or so, is that he got busy and he also opened up a cheese factory. And these mills were no small operation. It's 800,000 board feet of lumber each year. And so that was a fair bit. Now the cheese factory he opened is he also employed the gem to haul in the raw milk, and they pumped the way across the river, and opened up a pig operation on the Stairs Farm, or Stairs Point. Shortly before his death, the new hall was opened, and he and Mrs. Jenner led the parade through the town. And the town was very independent, and it had a lot of powerful people in it. And you could see from the background of people who came with education from King's College and so forth. So they voted themselves a government. The village government occurred in 1933, and the village government kept up the activities that were meant to draw the community together. And so they fostered the growth and socialization. And there's just a strong, strong sense of community. And some of the activities that started in those days have continued to today. Dinners at the hall, the Cavalcade of Color. Cavalcade of Color was a big affair, and they had parades, and they had the Queen of the Ball, and it involved the towns of Huntsville and Port Sydney and Port Carling and so forth. So the annual turkey dinner is still going. The Beast Feast, that was where the hunters supplied the food, and they had an annual feast. Dice on Ice, the Winter Carnival, the annual regatta, the triathlon, the Loppet. Bill Clark ran the Loppet, and it was done on the end of January, and there would be about 100 skiers, cross-country skiers, who would start from the Port Sydney dock and go across the lake. They wouldn't have been able to do that this year, and that changed because the skiers, instead of doing side-by-side skiing, they began to skate. So they started all of these 100 years ago, and let's hope they will continue. My wife wrote a poem that sets out the tone, and we can leave our visit to Port Sydney. It's called Clouds. It sort of tells about the transitory nature of the community and of these events. Across the rippling lake, beyond the island's necklace, rising imperiously over manicured hills, cascade of billowing clouds drift, sun drift to slate sage commingle, creating shifting phantom shapes or bodies of postures of repose, allowing mortal thoughts to float, a fleeting escape from reality and day-to-day anxieties that ambush and snare our dreams. So I want to thank you for being part of this glimpse into the history and life community. The Zoom presentations tend to be a very arid affair, and I'm sorry about that, but we will have a